There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the plain clothes of a Tuesday night, the familiar quiet of a shared living room, the low hum of a city settling into sleep outside the window. You don't recognize them as watershed moments, as the continental divide of your own personal history, until long after they have passed. And then, in retrospect, you see it all with a painful, startling clarity, the before and the after. For me, that moment was a dare, spoken so softly it was almost swallowed by the silence between us. It was a question wrapped in a challenge, a plea hidden inside a provocation. It was Leo, looking at me from the other end of the couch, his face half lost in the shadows cast by a single floor lamp, his eyes holding a universe of something I was too terrified to name. He had been staring at the scuffed toes of his sneakers for what felt like an hour, the bottle of wine on the coffee table between us mostly empty. The conversation had died a slow, natural death, fading from his work frustrations to the movie we'd half-watched, and finally into this, a quiet so dense it felt like a physical presence in the room. I was used to silence with Leo. Our friendship was built on a foundation of comfortable quiet, of existing in the same space without the frantic need to fill it with noise. But this was different. This silence was taut, a wire pulled to its breaking point. I could feel it in my own chest, a sympathetic tension that made it hard to draw a full breath. I was a cartographer of Leo's moods, a student of his subtle shifts in emotional weather for the better part of a decade, and I knew this was not a storm passing. This was the pressure dropping before the hurricane makes landfall. My own heart was a frantic, caged bird, beating its wings against my ribs. I had spent years meticulously building the walls of our friendship, reinforcing them with every platonic pat on the back, every brotherly shove, every carefully maintained inch of distance on this very couch. I was the keeper of my own secret, a lonely watchman pacing the battlements of a castle he had built to protect himself from the one person he desperately wanted to let inside. My love for him was a language I had never learned to speak, a collection of images and sensations stored in the darkroom of my mind. The way his hair curled behind his ears when it got too long, the specific cadence of his laugh when he was genuinely amused, the fan of his eyelashes against his cheek when he was asleep. These were my treasures, my private collection of moments, and I guarded them fiercely. To risk them, to risk everything, for a moment of impossible hope felt like madness. And then he looked up. His gaze met mine across the small expanse of the worn, gray couch, and the wire of silence snapped. "I dare you," he said. His voice was a low murmur, rough around the edges from the wine and the late hour. The words hung in the air, shimmering and dangerous. My mind went blank. A dare? We weren't college kids anymore, not the boys who would dare each other to do a backflip off the high dive or talk to the prettiest girl at the bar. We were men, approaching 30, with jobs and responsibilities and intricately messy lives. A dare felt like a relic from another time, an artifact from a friendship that was simpler, safer. "Dare me to what?" I asked, and I was proud of how steady my own voice sounded, how it betrayed none of the violent tremor in my hands, which were clenched into fists on my knees. Leo didn't smile. His expression was intensely serious, his eyes searching mine for something I couldn't decipher. It felt as if he were trying to solve a complex equation, and my face was the only variable he had to work with. The silence stretched again, but this time it was different. It was the silence of a held breath, of a world waiting for a single pin to drop. He leaned forward just a fraction of an inch, a barely perceptible shift of weight, but it felt like the whole room tilted on its axis. "I dare you to kiss me," he whispered. And there it was, the moment, disguised as a foolish, drunken dare on a Tuesday night. The ordinary clothes fell away, and I saw it for what it was, the end of one world, and the possible, terrifying beginning of another. My entire history with him, every shared joke, every late-night conversation, every secret hope I had ever harbored, all coalesced into this single, impossible point in time. The dare was a door, thrown open in the middle of a long, windowless hallway I had been walking for years. And on the other side, there was either a cliff edge or a garden. I had no way of knowing which. All I knew was that Leo was waiting, his eyes never leaving mine, daring me to step through. To understand the weight of that dare, You have to understand the foundation it threatened to shatter. Leo and I met our freshman year of college, two very different orbits that somehow found a common gravitational pull. We were both on the swim team, but that's where the similarities seemed to end. He was the star, a freestyler who moved through the water with a brutal, beautiful efficiency, all power and churning grace. He was loud, effortlessly charming, the kind of person who collected friends like other people collected spare change. He was sunshine and raw energy, a supernova in the crowded, chlorinated world of collegiate athletics. I, on the other hand, was a diver. My world was one of quiet precision, of solitary focus. It was about the controlled fall, the perfect entry, the silent ripple. I spent my time on a platform high above the chaos of the pool, observing. It was a role I was comfortable with, both in the water and out of it. Our friendship started not with a grand gesture, but with a series of small, mundane collisions. We were assigned as roommates in a cramped dorm room that always smelled faintly of damp towels and cheap pizza. He would come crashing in at 2 in the morning, smelling of beer and the crisp night air, and instead of being annoyed, I found myself listening for the sound of his key in the lock. He would find me hunched over a developing tray in the makeshift darkroom I'd set up in our tiny, shared bathroom, the red safe light casting an infernal glow on my face. And instead of complaining about not being able to shower, he would just lean against the doorframe and watch, fascinated. He was the only person who didn't seem to think my obsession with photography was strange. He called the images I took little captured ghosts. He learned my silences, and I learned his noises. I knew the specific sigh that meant he was frustrated with a coding problem for his computer science major, the sound of his foot tapping when he was anxious about a big meet, the way he hummed off-key when he was truly content. And he, in turn, learned to read the things I never said. He knew when my quiet was peaceful and when it was troubled. He'd appear with 2 cups of coffee without a word, placing one on my desk before retreating to his own side of the room, a simple, unspoken acknowledgement that he saw me. We became an unlikely pair, the boisterous swimmer and the quiet diver, his energy a current that pulled me along, my stillness an anchor that seemed to ground him. My feelings for him didn't arrive in a sudden flash of lightning. They developed slowly, like one of my photographs in a chemical bath. At first, the image was faint, indistinct. It was just a deep, abiding affection, an appreciation for his presence in my life. I loved his loyalty, the way he would defend a friend with a ferocity that was startling. I loved his unexpected moments of thoughtfulness, like remembering the specific brand of film I liked and picking it up for me on a whim. But over time, the image sharpened. The lines became clearer, the shadows deepened. I started noticing things I shouldn't have. The flex of the muscles in his back as he pulled himself from the pool. The way a stray drop of water would cling to his lower lip. The warmth of his shoulder pressed against mine when we were crammed onto a bus with the rest of the team. These observations were dangerous. I knew it. I tried to suppress them, to push them back down into the murky depths of my subconscious. I was a photographer. My job was to observe, to capture, not to feel. I framed him in my viewfinder, both literally and metaphorically, creating a distance that felt safe. I took hundreds of photos of him, a black and white portrait where the light caught the intensity in his eyes just before a race, a candid shot of him laughing, head thrown back, oblivious to the camera, a silhouette of him standing on the edge of the pool at dawn. These pictures were my only permissible outlet. I could pour all my unspoken adoration into the composition, the lighting, the focus. I could love him on paper, in silver gelatin prints that I kept hidden in a box under my bed. It was a lonely, pathetic kind of love, but it was mine, and it felt safer than the alternative. The alternative was losing him. I had seen him with girlfriends. He fell in love the same way he swam, with an all-consuming, powerful intensity. He would throw his entire being into a relationship, and for a time, he would be incandescently happy. I learned to play my part. I was the supportive best friend, the one who listened to him talk for hours about a new girl, the one who offered a shoulder when things inevitably fell apart. Each time, I felt a piece of myself chip away. It was a slow, agonizing erosion, but I endured it because the thought of my life without Leo in it at all was a black hole, a vacuum I couldn't bear to contemplate. So I built my fortress of friendship higher and stronger, convincing myself that what I had was enough. It had to be. After college, our lives diverged, but our friendship held. He went to work for a big tech firm in the city, writing code that powered some app one never fully understood. I stayed, carving out a life as a freelance photographer, shooting weddings, local sports, and quiet landscapes. We moved into separate apartments in the same sprawling city, but my place, with its cheap rent and big windows, became our unofficial home base. He had a key. It was an unspoken rule that if he needed a place to crash, or just a quiet space to decompress from his high-stress job, my door was always open. Our friendship settled into a comfortable domesticity, a rhythm of weekly dinners, shared bottles of wine, and an easy intimacy that was the bedrock of my world. I told myself I was content. I had his friendship, his trust, his presence. It was a feast compared to the starvation of losing him completely. I learned to live on the crumbs of what I really wanted, and for a long time, I almost convinced myself I was full. The shift began, as so many shifts do, with an ending. Leo had been dating a woman named Claire for almost 3 years. She was nice enough, an architect who was as driven and meticulously planned as he was. They were a power couple, their lives mapped out in 5-year increments. Marriage, a house in the suburbs, 2.5 kids. I thought this would be the one that stuck. I had prepared myself for it, rehearsed the best man speech in my head, practiced the smile I would wear at their wedding. I was ready to seal that final part of my heart away for good. And then, one rainy Thursday in October, my buzzer rang at midnight. It was Leo, soaked to the bone, holding a single, sad-looking cardboard box filled with a few books and a framed photo. He didn't have to say a word. I just buzzed him in, and when he appeared at my door, dripping onto the worn wooden floor, I stepped aside and let him enter. He walked to the center of my living room and stood there for a long moment, water pooling around his feet. The box in his arms seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. "It's over," he said, his voice hollow, empty. She said we were checking off boxes, not building a life. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were full of a bewildered hurt that was far more painful to see than simple sadness. It wasn't just the loss of Claire, it was the loss of the blueprint. Leo, the man who always had a plan, was suddenly adrift in an ocean of uncertainty, his map torn to pieces. I didn't say, "I'm sorry," I didn't offer platitudes. I just took the box from his arms and set it on the floor. I went to the kitchen and made him a cup of tea, the way my mother used to for me when I was a sick child. When I came back, he was sitting on the edge of the couch, staring into space, shivering. I draped a blanket over his shoulders. He stayed for 3 days. He barely spoke, moving through my apartment like a ghost. He would sit on the couch for hours, or stand at the window, watching the rain. I worked around him, editing photos at my desk, the quiet clicks of my mouse the only sound in the room. I made meals he barely touched. On the 3rd night, I found him asleep on the couch, his face etched with a tension that sleep hadn't eased. His breathing was shallow, his hand clenched around the edge of a cushion. He looked profoundly, heartbreakingly lonely. Without thinking, I knelt on the floor and gently smoothed the furrow between his brows with my thumb. His expression softened instantly, a flicker of peace in the midst of his turmoil. It was a tiny, intimate gesture, one that crossed a line I had so carefully drawn. But in that moment, seeing his pain, I didn't care. The need to comfort him was a physical ache in my own chest, overriding years of self-preservation. That night was the catalyst. It was the beginning of the new ritual. After he finally went back to his own apartment, the silence he left behind in mine was deafening. But then he started coming back. At first, it was under pretexts. He'd forgotten a charger, or he was in the neighborhood and wanted to see if I was free for dinner. But soon, the excuses fell away. He would just show up, usually late, his face worn down by the day. He'd sink into the familiar contours of my couch as if it were the only solid ground in the world. He started talking, not just about the breakup, but about everything. His job felt meaningless. His friends felt distant. He felt like he was performing a version of himself that he didn't recognize anymore. My apartment became his sanctuary, and I, his silent confessor. I would just listen, letting his words wash over me, offering nothing but my quiet, steady presence. I was terrified. Every night he spent on my couch, every vulnerable confession he shared, felt like he was handing me a piece of his broken heart. I didn't know how to hold it all without shattering myself. My own carefully constructed walls were beginning to crumble, eroded by the constant, gentle tide of his need. The line between friendship and something more was blurring into an unrecognizable haze, and I was losing my footing. I was drowning in him, and the most terrifying part was that I didn't want to be saved. The ritual began subtly, an unspoken evolution born of his exhaustion and my quiet compliance. The first few times after the breakup, he would fall asleep on my couch fully clothed, waking up stiff and disoriented around 3 in the morning to stumble back to his own apartment. I would lie awake in my bed, listening for the soft click of the front door, a sound that echoed the hollowness in my own chest. Then came the night I found him shivering, the thin throw blanket I owned hopelessly inadequate against the late autumn chill. I went to my linen closet and pulled out the heavy down comforter from my own bed. I unfolded it and gently draped it over him. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open for a moment, clouded with sleep. He registered my presence, a flicker of recognition, and then murmured something unintelligible before burrowing deeper under the warmth. I stood there for a long time, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest, my hand hovering in the air, wanting so badly to touch his hair, to soothe the worry from his brow again. I resisted, but that night, a new precedent was set. My couch became his bed, my comforter his cocoon. The progression was so natural, so insidious, that I almost didn't see it happening. A week later, he showed up late, looking utterly defeated. He'd had a brutal week at work, topped off by a tense, awkward encounter with Claire to exchange the last of their things. He dropped his bag by the door and just looked at me, his shoulders slumped. "Jules," he said, his voice raspy, "my back is killing me. I think your couch is permanently imprinted with the shape of my spine. Is it weird if I just crash in your bed? I promise I'll stick to one side." My heart stopped. It was a simple, logical request. My bed was a queen, more than big enough for 2 people, especially 2 people who had shared cramped hotel beds countless times during our swimming years. But this felt different. This wasn't a matter of post-meet exhaustion and limited resources. This was a choice. It was an escalation of an intimacy that was already threatening to overwhelm me. The architecture of our friendship was being renovated without my consent, a wall being torn down in the dead of night. "Of course," I said, my voice betraying nothing. "It's fine. Take the side by the wall." That night was a study in exquisite torture. I lay on my side of the bed, rigid, every nerve ending firing. I was hyper-aware of everything. The small space of cool sheets between us, the scent of his shampoo on the pillow next to mine, the sound of his breathing, deeper and more even than it had been on the couch. He had fallen asleep almost instantly, a testament to his bone-deep exhaustion. But I lay awake for hours, a sentry at the border of a country I was forbidden to enter. He was so close. All I had to do was reach out, to close the few inches that separated us. It would be so easy, and it would ruin everything. I felt like a man dying of thirst, staring at a glass of water that I knew was poisoned. The temptation was agonizing. This became the new ritual. 2 or 3 nights a week, he would end up at my place. The pretext of the sore back was used once, maybe twice, before it was discarded like an unnecessary piece of furniture. It became the unspoken default. He would arrive, we would talk or watch a movie, and when the hour grew late, he would simply stand up, stretch, and say, "I'm heading to bed," as if it were his own. He started keeping a toothbrush in my bathroom, a spare t-shirt and sweats in my bottom drawer. My apartment, my life, was slowly, inexorably merging with his. He was weaving himself into the very fabric of my existence, and I was letting him, stitch by painful, hopeful stitch. Each night was a masterclass in self-control. I learned to regulate my breathing to match his, hoping the shared rhythm would trick my body into a semblance of calm. I became an expert in the geography of the mattress, acutely aware of the dip his weight created, the way the sheets would shift when he rolled over in his sleep. Sometimes, in the depths of the night, he would move, an arm thrown out in a dream, his hand brushing my back or his leg tangling with mine. These accidental touches were electric, jolts of pure lightning that left me breathless. He would never stir, completely oblivious to the havoc he was wreaking on my nervous system. I would lie perfectly still, not daring to breathe, savoring the fleeting, unintentional contact until he shifted away again, leaving my skin buzzing, and my heart aching with a desperate, cavernous loneliness. I photographed him in my mind. I framed the image of him asleep, the morning light from the window tracing the line of his jaw. I captured the moment he yawned, his face crumpling into a boyish vulnerability. I developed these images in the darkness behind my closed eyes, adding them to my secret collection. My art had always been about finding the beauty in the quiet, overlooked moments, and my life had become a living embodiment of my work. I was living inside a photograph that no one else could see, a long exposure of longing and restraint. The anxiety was a constant, low-grade hum beneath the surface of my days. I was living on a knife's edge, perpetually waiting for the other shoe to drop. Was he aware of what he was doing? Was this a conscious choice, a slow, deliberate campaign to see how far he could push me before I broke? Or was I just a convenience, a warm body, a place of comfort so familiar it had become platonic to the point of being neuter? I would analyze every word, every gesture, searching for a clue. The way he'd lean his head on my shoulder while we watched TV. The casual way he'd walk around my apartment in just a pair of boxers. The time he'd grab my hand to pull me toward a food truck he wanted to try, his fingers laced through mine for 3 full seconds longer than necessary. Each of these moments was a breadcrumb, and I was a starving man, unsure if they were leading me toward a feast or a trap. The plausible deniability was killing me. Everything he did could be interpreted in 2 ways. He was either completely oblivious, treating me with the unthinking physical intimacy of a brother, or he was testing the waters, sending out subtle, deniable signals to see if I would respond. The ambiguity was a form of psychological warfare, and I was losing. My hope, a thing I had tried to starve for years, was growing stronger, fed by this nightly ritual of proximity and accidental touch. It was a terrifying, beautiful, and utterly unsustainable state of being. I knew it had to end. I just didn't know if the ending would be a quiet dawn or a catastrophic explosion. And then came the Tuesday night with the wine. He had been quiet all evening, not the sad, hollow quiet of the initial breakup, but a thoughtful, introspective quiet. He seemed to be wrestling with something, his gaze distant. We sat on the couch, the way we used to before the ritual of the shared bed had begun, and it felt like a strange regression, a step back into a more formal, defined space. The air was thick with all the nights spent just inches apart, all the unspoken words, all the carefully avoided truths. The silence wasn't comfortable anymore. It was charged, electric, a space filled with ghosts of touches both real and imagined. I watched him stare at his shoes, my own heart a frantic drum against my ribs, and I knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that the ritual was about to be broken, one way or another. The years of quiet observation were over. The moment of action was upon me. He whispered the dare, "I dare you to kiss me," and the world fell away. The room, the city, the entire weight of our shared history, all of it collapsed into the space between his lips and mine. It was a terrifying offer, a tightrope stretched over a canyon. On one side was the safety of our friendship, the comfortable, aching loneliness I had known for years. On the other was this, a question mark, a precipice. My mind, usually a whirl of analysis and overthinking, went completely still. There was no room for calculation, no time to weigh the pros and cons. There was only the raw, undeniable truth of the moment. He was offering me the one thing I had wanted for a decade, and he was hiding it behind the flimsy shield of a dare. It was the shield that made my decision. The dare gave us both an out. If I did it and he recoiled, if it was a terrible, awkward mistake, we could laugh it off. It was just a stupid dare. A joke. It wasn't real. The plausible deniability he had been living in for months was now a gift he was offering to me. It was a safety net, and its presence was the only thing that gave me the courage to jump. I could see the fear in his eyes, mirroring my own. He wasn't challenging me. He was asking for permission. He was telling me, in the only way he knew how, that he was too scared to make the first move, so he needed me to do it for him. I didn't speak. I simply leaned across the space that separated us, a chasm that had felt miles wide just seconds before. The movement felt slow, syrupy, as if I were moving through water. I watched his eyes track my approach, his pupils dilating slightly. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. He just waited. My own breath was trapped in my lungs, a painful pressure behind my sternum. I was aware of the smallest details, a stray thread on the collar of his t-shirt, the faint scent of wine on his breath, the almost imperceptible tremor in his lower lip. And then I kissed him. It was the briefest of contacts, a gentle press of my lips against his. It was tentative, hesitant, a question in physical form. It held none of the passion I had fantasized about for years. It was chaste, almost clinical. It was a kiss designed for escape, a touch light enough to be denied. I felt the soft texture of his lips, a fleeting warmth, and then I pulled back, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped animal. The safety net was in place. I had done it. I had answered the dare. Now we could both retreat to our respective corners, pretend it never happened, and allow the fragile structure of our friendship to remain standing. I retreated to my end of the couch, the distance between us once again feeling vast and insurmountable. I couldn't look at him. I stared at the coffee table, at the half-empty wine bottle, my mind a roaring chaos of panic and regret. What had I done? I had broken the cardinal rule. I had crossed the line. The silence that followed was the most terrifying of all. It was not empty. It was filled with the deafening sound of my own failure. I had taken his dare, and now I had to face the consequences. I waited for the awkward laugh, the dismissive shrug, the well, that was weird, that would signal the end of everything. But it didn't come. Instead, I heard him take a slow, shaky breath. I risked a glance. He hadn't moved. He was still leaning forward slightly, his eyes closed now, as if he were trying to commit the sensation to memory. His expression was one of intense concentration, of profound and quiet revelation. A long moment passed, an eternity in which I lived and died 1,000 times. Then he opened his eyes. They were dark, deep, and stripped of all pretense. The fear was gone, replaced by a raw, staggering vulnerability that struck me to my very core. He looked at me, and for the first time, I felt like he was truly seeing me, not the friend, not the roommate, not the convenient harbor, but me, Julian. He whispered, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. It was barely audible, a sound meant only for me. Again, I just stared at him, confused. The roar in my head subsided to a low hum. Again, he repeated, a little stronger this time, a command wrapped in a plea. And then he delivered the final, devastating blow to every wall I had ever built. He held my gaze, his own unwavering, and said, but mean it, mean it. The two words dismantled me. They stripped away the dare, the safety net, the plausible deniability. They were an admission. That first kiss, the safe one, the one I had designed for an easy escape, wasn't what he wanted. He didn't want a joke. He didn't want a dare. He wanted the truth. He wanted the decade of longing I had kept locked away. He wanted the photographs under my bed, the silent observations, the ache in my chest. He was asking for the thing I was most terrified of giving, and he was doing it with a terrifying, beautiful honesty. This time, when I leaned in, there was no hesitation. There was no fear. There was only a sense of homecoming, of a lock finally clicking into place. I closed the distance between us and kissed him again. And this time, I meant it. I poured every unspoken word, every stolen glance, every secret hope into that single point of contact. It was a kiss of desperation and relief, of gratitude and grief for all the lost years. It was clumsy and urgent and utterly perfect. His hands came up to cup my face, his thumbs stroking my jaw, and he kissed me back with a corresponding hunger that stole the breath from my lungs. The wire that had been stretched taut between us for months, for years, didn't just snap. It vaporized, and in its place was this, a connection so profound, so real, it felt like it could recalibrate the stars. We were no longer on opposite sides of a divide. We had crossed it. We were finally, impossibly, on the same side. The aftermath began not with a bang, but with a profound and unsettling silence. The morning after the kiss, the second kiss, the one that had mattered, the light filtering through my bedroom window felt accusatory. I woke up first. Leo was still asleep beside me, his back to me, a clear dividing line of sheet between us, as if our bodies had unconsciously retreated to their familiar, platonic territories during the night. The air was still and heavy, thick with the memory of what had happened. The euphoria of the night before had evaporated with the darkness, leaving behind a nervous, brittle residue. I lay there, not moving, listening to the sound of his breathing, and a cold dread began to creep into my veins. He had asked for it. He had whispered, "Mean it," but as the sun rose higher, casting the sharp, unforgiving light of day onto our shared space, the words began to feel like a dream. Had I imagined the raw vulnerability in his eyes? Had I misinterpreted the desperate honesty in his voice? The man sleeping beside me was Leo, my best friend, the one who had a string of ex-girlfriends and a life plan that had never, not for a single moment, included me in this way. The events of the previous night felt like a beautiful, impossible mirage, and I was terrified that any movement, any word, would cause it to shimmer and disappear, leaving me alone in the desert of our friendship once more. When he finally stirred, it was with a slow, groggy reluctance. He rolled over, and for a fleeting second, his eyes met mine. I saw a flicker of something in them, confusion, panic, a shadow of the vulnerability from the night before, and then it was gone, replaced by a guarded blankness. He sat up, running a hand through his already messy hair, and pointedly avoided looking at me. I have an early meeting," he mumbled, his voice rough with sleep. He swung his legs out of bed and stood up, his back still to me. The casual, comfortable nudity of our shared mornings was gone. He seemed acutely aware of his own body, grabbing his clothes from the floor with a jerky, self-conscious haste. He didn't say my name. He didn't acknowledge the seismic shift that had occurred just hours before. He was treating it like a null set, a piece of corrupted data to be deleted from the system. I watched him dress, a hollow ache spreading through my chest. The quiet observer in me was cataloging every detail. The tension in his shoulders, the way he fumbled with the button on his jeans, the deliberate way he kept his face averted. He was building a wall between us, brick by silent brick, and I was too stunned, too hurt, to do anything but watch. "Leo," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He froze, his hand on the doorknob. He still didn't turn around. "I've got to go, Jules. I'm late." "Leo," I said again, a little stronger this time. "Last night." He finally turned, but only partially. He looked at me over his shoulder, and his face was a mask of strained neutrality. It was the face he used with clients he didn't like, a polite, impenetrable facade. It was a face he had never, in 10 years, used with me. "I was drunk," he said, the words flat and cold. "We were both drunk. It was a stupid dare. Let's just forget it, okay?" And then he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, and the sound was like a gunshot in the silent apartment. I sat there, in the wreckage of my bed, the sheets still holding the ghost of his warmth, and I felt the hope that had bloomed so brightly in my chest wither and die. It was worse than a simple rejection. It was an erasure. He had taken the most honest, vulnerable moment of my life and dismissed it as a drunken mistake. He had used the very excuse I thought we had dismantled, wielding it like a weapon to sever the connection we had forged. The man who had begged me to mean it was now pretending it had meant nothing at all. The whiplash was nauseating. I felt like a fool, a naive idiot who had mistaken a moment of lonely, intoxicated curiosity for a genuine confession of the heart. The days that followed were a special kind of hell. The silence from him was absolute. No texts, no calls, no late-night appearances at my door. It was as if he had vanished from the face of the earth. My apartment, which had been his sanctuary for months, felt vast and empty. Every corner held a memory of him. Every silence was a testament to his absence. The comforter on my bed felt too big, the other side of the mattress a cold, empty expanse. The ritual of his presence had been so deeply ingrained in my life that its sudden removal felt like a physical amputation. I was adrift. My initial hurt curdled into a slow-burning anger. It was an anger born of frustration and a profound sense of injustice. How dare he? How dare he crawl into my life, my bed, my heart, only to panic and flee when things became real? How dare he ask for my honesty, demand my vulnerability, and then punish me for giving it to him? I had spent years guarding my feelings, protecting our friendship at the cost of my own happiness, and he had demolished all of it in one night, only to run away from the rubble. He didn't get to do that. He didn't get to light the fire and then walk away, leaving me to burn. After 3 days of radio silence, I couldn't take it anymore. The uncertainty was eating me alive. I needed to know the truth. even if the truth was that I was nothing more than an experiment he now regretted. I put on my shoes, grabbed my keys, and walked the 12 blocks to his apartment. It was late, after 10, but I knew he would be home. His car was parked in its usual spot. Standing outside his door, my heart was a frantic, terrified thing. But my resolve was firm. I wasn't there to yell or to plead. I was there for an explanation. I deserved that much. I knocked. The sound was loud in the quiet hallway. I heard movement inside, then silence. I knocked again, harder this time. "Leo, I know you're in there. Open the door." A long moment passed, and I was about to turn away when I heard the sound of the deadbolt sliding back. The door opened a few inches, and he was there, framed in the narrow opening. He looked terrible. His hair was a mess. There were dark circles under his eyes, and he was wearing the same sweatshirt he'd had on 3 days ago. He looked like a man who had been hiding. "Jules," he said, his voice low and strained. "It's late. Let me in, Leo," I said, my tone quiet but unyielding. He hesitated for a second, then sighed in defeat and opened the door wider. I stepped inside. His apartment was a mess. Takeout containers littered the coffee table. Clothes were draped over chairs. It was the apartment of a man in the midst of a crisis, a stark contrast to the clean, orderly space he usually kept. He didn't look at me, just walked over to the window and stared out at the city lights, his arms crossed over his chest. He was creating a fortress of his own. I didn't sit down. I stood in the middle of the room, the silence stretching between us, a mirror of that night on my couch. But this time it was brittle with conflict instead of anticipation. "Talk to me," I said finally. "Don't you dare shut me out. Not after that. You don't get to do that to me." He flinched at my words, but didn't turn around. "There's nothing to talk about. I told you it was a mistake." "Was it?" I challenged, my voice rising slightly despite my best intentions. "Was it a mistake when you asked me to mean it? Because that didn't sound like a mistake, Leo. That sounded like the most honest thing you've ever said to me." That got through. His shoulders sagged, the defensive posture crumbling. He rested his forehead against the cool glass of the window, a gesture of utter defeat. "I can't," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Jules, I can't do this." "Can't do what?" I pressed, stepping closer. "Can't be honest with me? Can't face whatever it is you're feeling? You come to my apartment for months, you sleep in my bed, you let me hold you together while you're falling apart, and then you kiss me. You ask me to kiss you. And you think you can just walk away and say it was a mistake? Who do you think I am?" He finally turned around, and his face was a portrait of anguish. The mask was gone, and what was left was a raw, terrified confusion that mirrored what I had seen in his eyes right before he'd asked me to kiss him again. "I don't know what I'm doing," he burst out, his voice choked with frustration and fear. "Okay, I don't know. My life, everything fell apart. Claire, my job, the whole plan. It was all gone. And you were just there? You were the only thing that made sense. The only place I felt safe." He paced the small space between the window and the couch, running his hands through his hair in agitation. "I just needed to be near you. I didn't think about it. I needed it. And then that night, I was looking at you, and I wanted to know. I wanted to know what it would be like. I wanted to feel something real, something that wasn't part of the stupid plan. And it was real. God, Jules, it was the realest thing I've ever felt." He stopped pacing and looked at me, his eyes pleading. And it terrified me, because I don't know what it means. You're my best friend. You're the most important person in my life. What if I'm just confused? What if I'm just lonely and latching onto the closest, safest person? I can't. I can't risk you. I can't risk losing you because I'm a mess and I don't know what the hell I want. It's better to pretend it was a mistake than to ruin the only good thing I have left. I listened to his confession, and the anger inside me dissipated, replaced by a wave of profound, aching empathy. He wasn't being cruel. He was being scared. He wasn't rejecting me. He was trying to protect me, to protect us, in the most clumsy, self-destructive way possible. He had hidden behind a dare because he was afraid to ask for what he wanted, and now he was hiding behind an excuse because he was afraid of what he'd found. He wasn't a villain. He was just a man who was lost, whose emotional compass was spinning wildly, pointing in a direction he had never anticipated. I walked over to him, closing the remaining distance between us. I gently took his hands, which were clenched into tight fists at his sides, and uncurled his fingers. I held them in my own. Leo, I said softly. You think you're protecting me by pushing me away. But what you're really doing is telling me that my feelings don't matter. That a decade of my life, a decade of me loving you in silence, can be dismissed because you're scared. You're not the only one risking something here. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. You for how long? A long time, I said, my voice quiet but steady. A very long time. That kiss wasn't a mistake for me. It wasn't a moment of curiosity. It was an answer to a question I've been afraid to even ask myself for years. So you don't get to decide for both of us that it's too risky. You don't get to burn the whole thing down just because you're afraid of getting burned. Tears welled in his eyes, and he didn't try to hide them. He just stared at me, his carefully constructed world completely dismantled, not just by his own feelings, but now by the reality of mine. The truth was finally out, all of it, laid bare in the messy chaos of his apartment. There were no more dares, no more excuses, no more places to hide. There was only us, standing in the rubble, finally, terrifyingly honest. The resolution didn't arrive like a sudden sunrise, but more like a slow, tentative dawn, the light creeping over the horizon inch by painful inch. That night in Leo's apartment, after all the truths had been spilled, we didn't fall into a passionate embrace. We just stood there for a long time, holding hands in the middle of his messy living room. The silence no longer a weapon or a shield, but a space to breathe. It was a silence of processing, of recalibration. He was looking at me as if seeing me for the first time, not as the fixed point in his chaotic life, but as a person with his own history, his own secret pain, his own capacity for love. And I was looking at him, not as an unattainable ideal, but as a man who was just as scared and confused as I was. I'm sorry, he whispered, and the words were heavy with the weight of his panic, his withdrawal, his clumsy attempt to protect us. Jules, I am so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. That was the one thing I never wanted to do. I know, I said. And I did. But you can't run away from it, Leo. We can't. Whatever this is, we have to face it together. He nodded, a single, decisive movement. A choice. Okay, he said, his voice still shaky, but with a new thread of resolve running through it. Okay, together. We didn't stay at his apartment that night. The space felt contaminated with his panic and my hurt. Without another word, he grabbed his keys and followed me back to my place. Back to our sanctuary. When we walked through my door, the air felt different. It was still our space, but the unspoken tension that had charged it for months was gone, replaced by a fragile, hopeful clarity. He didn't gravitate toward the couch or my bedroom. He just stood in the entryway, waiting for me to lead, to define the new terms of our existence. I led him to the kitchen and made us both tea, a bookend to the night his world had first fallen apart. We sat at my small kitchen table, the two mugs warming our hands, and we talked. We talked for hours. He told me about the suffocating pressure of the life he thought he was supposed to want, about the loneliness he felt even when he was surrounded by people. He talked about how my quiet apartment had become the only place he could take off the armor, the only place he felt he didn't have to perform. And I talked too. I told him about the years of quiet observation, about the photographs hidden under my bed, about the exquisite pain of watching him love other people. I explained how his sudden, desperate need for comfort had been both a gift and a torment. It was a conversation built not on grand declarations of love, but on the quiet, painstaking work of laying down a new foundation, one brick of honesty at a time. We were two architects, surveying the rubble of what we had been, and beginning the slow, deliberate process of designing what we could become. There was no talk of labels, no discussion of a future beyond the next sunrise. The goal was simply to exist in this new, honest space without panicking, without retreating into old habits. When we finally went to bed, exhaustion had settled deep in our bones. I took my usual side, and he took his. For a long moment, we lay on our backs, staring at the ceiling, the familiar few inches of space between us. The silence felt different now. It was a shared quiet, a space of mutual understanding. Then, slowly, tentatively, he rolled onto his side to face me. Would it be okay, he asked, his voice soft in the darkness, if I held your hand? It was the opposite of a dare. It was a question, direct and vulnerable. It was a request for permission, an acknowledgement of the boundaries he had previously trampled in his confusion. A wave of tenderness so profound it almost hurt washed over me. Yes, I whispered. It would be okay. He reached across the space between us, and his fingers found mine. He laced them together, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. It was a simple, gentle contact, but it was more intimate, more real, than any of the accidental touches or even the desperate kisses that had come before it. This was intentional. This was chosen. This was the beginning of our new language. We fell asleep like that, hands clasped between us, a small, solid bridge across the divide. The days that followed were a lesson in quiet intention. The rituals of our friendship were slowly, carefully rebuilt with this new honesty. He still came over most nights, but there were no more pretexts. He came over because he wanted to be with me. We still shared my bed, but the space between us began to shrink. The hand-holding became a nightly occurrence, a silent affirmation before sleep. Then, one night, he rolled over and simply draped his arm over my waist, pulling me against his chest, his chin resting on the top of my head. He fell asleep like that, his breathing a steady, warm puff against my hair. I lay there, wrapped in his arms, and felt a sense of peace so deep it felt like settling into my own skin for the first time. There was no anxiety, no overanalysis. There was just the solid, comforting weight of him, the steady beat of his heart against my back. He was home. We were home. Our intimacy grew in these small, domestic moments. It was in the way he started making the coffee in the morning, remembering exactly how I liked it. It was in the way I would rest my hand on the small of his back as I passed behind him in the kitchen. It was in the easy, comfortable silences that returned, no longer charged with unspoken longing, but filled with a quiet, certain contentment. We learned to kiss again, slowly. Our kisses were no longer desperate or questioning. They were soft, sure, and frequent. A quick press of lips as he left for work, a lingering kiss goodnight, a gentle kiss on the forehead just because. One Saturday afternoon, months later, I was in my darkroom, developing a new set of prints. The red safe light cast its familiar, otherworldly glow over everything. I had started taking pictures of him again, but these were different. They weren't the stolen, distant observations of before. They were close, intimate portraits. A shot of his hand resting on my pillow. A close-up of his smile, the real one, the one that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. The curve of his neck as he read a book on the couch. Leo leaned against the doorframe, just as he had done all those years ago in our college dorm. He didn't say anything, just watched me work, a small, soft smile on his face. I clipped a freshly developed print to the line to dry. It was a picture of us, a selfie I had taken one morning. We were both still half asleep, his arm slung around me, my head on his shoulder. We looked rumpled and messy and profoundly happy. "A new ghost for the collection?" he asked softly, his voice full of warmth. I smiled, turning to look at him. "No," I said. "This one's not a ghost. This one's real." He walked over to me, stepping into the red-tinged darkness of my small, sacred space. He wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder and looking at the row of drying prints. He saw the progression, the stolen moments from years ago, and the shared, open moments of now. He saw the whole story, laid out in silver and light. "I'm glad," he whispered into my ear, his breath warm against my neck. I was so tired of being a ghost. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we'd learned to create together. We found that the most profound declarations of love weren't spoken in grand statements, but in the quiet, daily acts of choosing each other. In the closed bedroom door that signaled not exclusion, but the sanctity of a shared space. In the pot of coffee brewed just right. In a hand reached for in the dark. The most terrifying dare wasn't the kiss. It was the whispered confession that followed, the demand for an honesty that forced us to dismantle our fears and build something real from the wreckage. It was a slow, painstaking process of discovery, of learning that the safest harbor wasn't a place you could find on a map, but a home you built, carefully and intentionally, in the heart of another person.